Hello and welcome to our segment on constructing a 16th century chemise. It was also called a shift. The term chemise comes from the Italian camisa, and it was a very basic undergarment. It was worn next to the body between an outer layer that was either more expensive or harder to clean fabric, sometimes both. So it took most of the wear and tear, got most of the washing. It's constructed very simply of rectangles and triangles, and was very economical as far as not wasting fabric, because remember, we're looking at a time period when pre-industrial revolution, everything was still woven by hand. There are a couple different options pattern-wise for making this. The one I'm using is the Margot Anderson pattern. It's very well laid out, excellent directions, easy to use if you don't want to use it. Another option is American Duchess, has a pattern that's put out by Simplicity. This is actually for an 18th century chemise, but it's changed very little over time. It's not that different. This one you should still be able to get in the Simplicity pattern catalog. Another option, Tudor Tailor has in their section on chemises several different designs. We'll talk about that in just a moment. It's graphed out, so you will need to graph it up, or if you don't want that option, you can also go to the Elizabethan costume page on the web. They have what they call a custom chemise generator. You plug in your measurements and they will graph out for you, of course small scale, a pattern designed to fit, and you just have to graph it up. If you're using a pattern, you'll have to trace it off, and several options for doing that. This is just typical tissue paper like you would find at Christmas in a gift, either for wrapping paper or if you're using it in a gift bag. You don't want to crumple it up too much, and it does tear easy, but it's inexpensive, easy to find at a drugstore, any place like that. If you don't want to use that, there's the option of using butcher's paper, pattern tracing paper if you can find it, or you can use interfacing, which if you're a sewer, you probably have some of that around. The main thing to remember, just use what's on hand, keep it simple, you don't have to spend a lot of money. Now I have chosen to make this, since it's a first go at using the pattern and I've made some changes, I've chosen to use the cotton when normally it would have been linen. Also, it probably would have had what we call today French seams. Linen has a tendency to ravel, so you wanted to enclose anything, an edge, a raw edge like that, in a seam, what we today call a French seam. If you're going to do that, then you're probably pretty confident your pattern's going to come out fine. But the thing that I wanted to do first, since I had made some changes before I used a more expensive fabric, was to initially use a cheaper fabric. If you look at what I've done here, the patterns that I've mentioned, and also the one on the Elizabethan costume webpage, have a straight sleeve. I've added a fuller sleeve with a cuff and a ruffle. The reason I've done that is because we're going to be wearing this at a Renaissance fair in the summer when it's hot and muggy, and by doing it this way, we've eliminated one layer, where normally if you had the straight sleeve, you would have what we would call today a blouse over it, and that's an additional layer. On a hot day, let's keep the layering as minimal as we can. Another thing I've done with having changed the pattern, there are going to be a couple of other pieces that you're going to need to cut out. They're very simple, straight pieces, no curves. If you've never done a gusset before, whether you're an experienced sewer or beginning sewer, gussets aren't that common anymore. Used to be used historically a lot more than they are today. So I'll show you how to sit in the gusset. The change I made in the sleeve the gusset would be there either way, whether you do the sleeve like I've done it or if you do a straight sleeve. So really that isn't affected by it. What I've tried to do to give you an idea, leaving this half stitched, is show you construction wise. We've got the main part of the garment, front and back, which is just a rectangle. The triangular portion down here is also a gusset. This has one side of it that's on the bias. That tends to stretch. Anything on the bias is prone to stretching. You might want to actually run a narrow stitch along the edge to keep it from stretching anymore. You will probably find when you go to hem this garment that it doesn't hang perfectly level. That's fine. It's an undergarment. It doesn't matter. It's not going to be seen. And that's another reason why we're starting with this for our Renaissance outfit, simply because if you're going to make any mistakes, and this is simply a learning experience, make them now because they won't be as obvious. The Margot Anderson pattern uses a square neck, again, typical of the Tudor era, with a facing. A lot of chemises historically, if you look, they've just got a rolled edge. This tends to be a little bit easier, more secure. It's up to you, whichever you prefer to use. What we will do next is go to the sewing machine. I will show you how to sit in the gusset and then how to do the cuff and the ruffle. So I'll see you there. Sewing in a gusset is actually much easier than sewing in a sleeve. If you're sitting in a sleeve, you're doing it on a curve, and that can lead to a bit of hair pulling sometimes. In this case, I'm simply sewing a straight seam along one edge till I come to the dot that I've marked, which is the seam width, stopping, pulling the needle up, turning back round and stitching a few stitches back merely to reinforce it. It's not too terribly crucial. You don't, however, want your stitches to pull out. And then I'm going to cut the thread and pivot. And of course, don't forget to take your pins out. And this is, of course, being done right sides together. I've made the pivot. Now I need to repin it. I'm sewing a 5/8 seam here. That's what the pattern specifies. If you look at a lot of historical garments, they only had a 1/2 inch seam, probably to economize on material, but the standard these days is 5/8. And really, it's only 1/8 of an inch difference, so it's not too terribly crucial. All right, and then we're stitching it down this side. Be sure we have everything lined up. And you want to be sure you don't accidentally sew in an extra bit of your sleeve. That means you'll have to rip your seam out, which is exasperating. Again, nobody died, not to stress. And we're coming down to where the dot was before and stopping and pivoting to back stitch. If you haven't already figured it out, this is an old treadle. All it does is stitch straight forward and stop. It suits me to a T, but I know a lot of people who sew on more modern machines can just hit the button and back stitch much more quickly. Now, normally, if I were following the pattern the way it's supposed to be, I would go ahead and stitch down this seam. However, in this case, we're not going to do that. The reason being because I've put on the cuff with the ruffle. So our next step, and I've already cut out the pieces, our next step is to take our cuff ruffle, and I've measured my wrist. This is the top piece, which will go around my wrist like that. But before we can put the bottom piece on, we need to insert the ruffle. Depending on the weight of your fabric you're using for your garment, you would want your ruffle to be anywhere between 2 and 3 times the length of your cuff. And I've got a 1-inch cuff piece here. I've cut this. It's actually 2 inches wide, 8 inches long. If I were using a very fine muslin like lawn or cambric, then I would have it longer. But the weight of this, it seems to work best having it just twice the length of the cuff piece. So what I need to do, and you can just finger press this, is to stitch down at each end, just a small seam. And in this case, I'm only going to have about a 1/2 inch seam, simply because it'll have to be turned and trimmed anyhow. Pin that in place. And once I've done that, I can gather it. I'll pin that the other way. So stitch there. Actually, rather than having to cut the thread, we'll just pull it out a bit and start over on the other end. Then I can trim it back. Don't quite look how that looks. No, it's okay. Had it looked uneven, but it's not. It's where it started to ravel a bit on that end, but that's okay, because that's going to be in the seam. Okay, the ends are stitched, and the next thing I will do is show you how to run the gathering threads. Now again, if I had a more modern machine, some of them will do a lovely gathering thread for you. This one, again, it's just too old. But I like the speed of it. It's what I learned on, and it's what I'm used to. So there you go. All right, the next thing I will show you is how to do the gathering stitch for the ruffle. I hope you can see this clearly. I've tried to pick a contrasting color for my gathering threads, but the light is fading it out a bit, I believe. What I've done is stitched by hand 2 rows of thread, one below where I'm going to stitch my seam and one above. And I'm going to pull from this end to draw in the ruffle. And I basically want to get it approximately the length of my cuff, which I have not stitched yet. But this is just to show you how I'm arriving at that point. Once I've drawn it in to approximately the right size, I'll lay it out on the cuff, take a pin at both ends to hold it steady, keep the length I want, and you can see how it's very uneven. I'll take this pin to smooth out the gathers and try to get them even before I stitch it down, or before I even pin it to stitch it down. And I believe I misspoke earlier when I was talking about lawn and cambric. Those are both very fine weights of linen. This, of course, is a cotton muslin. Being the first time I've tried the pattern since making a change in it, I don't want to use the more expensive linen. And this will be perfectly wearable at a Renaissance event, even though it's not entirely correct for the period. But that roughly is how I would gather in a ruffle by hand. And then you wind the ends of the thread around your pin at the end to hold it in place. When you've got it roughly how you want it distributed. Of course, this is not ready to be stitched down yet by any means, just to give you an idea. Our next step will be to actually stitch our cuff and then stitch our ruffle to it. As you can see, I've got my ruffle sewn in. It's sandwiched between the top and the bottom cuff pieces. Some of the gathering, the distribution didn't come out quite as evenly as I would have hoped. However, in this case, since this is a first try on this change in the pattern, and the fact that this isn't linen, it's just cotton muslin, and I will be wearing this around horses. It'll spend most of its life in the laundry basket, most likely. Also, the fact that when you wrap it around your wrist, you really don't see the fact that the distribution's a bit uneven. I'm not going to rip it out and change it. The other thing I've done, I could have assembled the entire garment, put the sleeve in, and the reason I didn't is because I'd be wrestling the entire chemise, and wrestling with that versus just having the sleeve to work on, it's a lot simpler having it by itself just like this. So what I've done now, I've run the same 2 rows of gathering stitches as I did before when I did the cuff ruffle to gather in the sleeve to fit the cuff, and now I'm simply going to stitch it down. Then I'll be able to turn the cuff, fold in the ends, and I'll just whip stitch this down by hand once it's stitched. And then at that point, I'll be ready to sew the sleeve with the gusset onto the chemise itself, and we'll be done. Hello, as you can see, I've finished gathering the ruffled end of the sleeve, and it's been sewn to the cuff. What I've done now is taken the second piece of the cuff, which will be the underside, and I'm basically hem stitching it down along this edge to enclose the gathered end of the sleeve. Another thing you have to consider when you're doing this is how are you going to fasten this? You've got 3 options basically. Today we would automatically put in a buttonhole and use a button. In period, that, I'm not saying it wasn't done, it was, but it wasn't as commonly used as either a loop, which fastened around a button, or a piece of what today most likely you'll find would be twill tape or cord. This is a 1/4 inch piece. It's nice because it stays tied better than the shiny polyester ribbon that you'll find at the fabric store, which looks very pretty. But the problem you're going to run into, if you have it at the neck, that's fine. You can tie it yourself. If you're by yourself getting dressed, you're going to have to find somebody who can tie your cuffs for you, because I'm not saying you can't do it yourself, but it tends to be awkward, and if you're using the slippery polyester ribbon, it's going to need frequent retying most likely. So again, consider your options, but I would recommend the twill tape over the polyester ribbon. Another thing completely correct for the period would be cord, a lightweight cord. So the choice is yours. Once I'm done doing this and have put in the twill tape, and then I can stitch up the ends, the last thing we need to do is to actually set our sleeve into the body of the chemise, sew up the side seams, and we're done. With the twill tape added to the cuff for ties, and with a 1/4 inch rolled hem that I've stitched in by hand at the bottom, our chemise is done. A couple things you'll notice, and they're both correct for the time period. The gores, because they're on the bias, even though I stitched them to try and reinforce it along the bias edge, the gores make the hem uneven. On each side it hangs a bit lower. That's fine, don't stress over it. 1, it's correct for the period, and 2, this is an undergarment. Nobody's going to see it. The other thing you'll probably notice, the way this is set in at the sleeve here at the top, you'll see it's a very off the shoulder sleeve. That's fine. Again, it's correct for the time period. This is an undergarment. Nobody's going to see it. So congratulations on having finished your first piece of your Renaissance Fair outfit. Our next project is going to be the partlet, which fills in the neck area here. So I hope you join me next for that. See you soon.